Well, it's Long John, Long John, he's long gone, long gone, he's long gone, he's long gone, he's long gone.
The year is 1807, and Parliament has passed the Slave Trade Act, abolishing British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, and this has led to the creation of the West Africa Squadron. Commencing in 1808, the squadron's main task was to patrol the west coast of Africa, suppressing any rogue slavers who continue to operate there illegally. Based here in Portsmouth, they initially deployed 2 ships. However, as time went on, they grew steadily, and at the height of their operations, they employed around 1/6 of the Royal Navy and Marines. Despite continuing struggles concerning the scale of the task, risk of disease, as well as boredom, the squadron still played a significant part for the next 50 years in the prevention of illegal slave trading.
Well, it's Long John, Long John, he's long gone, long gone.
Hello there. Here today you join me in Portsmouth, a city known for its strong nautical tradition and history. It is presently one of 3 of the active operating bases for the British Royal Navy and is home to around 2/3 of the National Fleet. Built in 1495 by Henry VII, it was the first dry dock in Europe, making it currently the oldest still standing, showing Portsmouth's impressive past.
Many famous ships have been built and docked in this very harbour. The most famous of these is perhaps the Mary Rose. Built in 1510 and launched to the seas a year later, it played a vital part in the wars against Scotland and France, right up until its sinking in 1545. The ship's remains have since been rediscovered, and by 1982 the ship had been rescued. Now restored to its former glories, it serves as an attraction to both the academics and the general public alike. With over 7 million visits since its opening in 1983, we can here see Portsmouth's rich naval history and how it has captured the public's imagination.
While no new ships were commissioned in the years 1558 to 1648, marine operations in Portsmouth still proved key in fighting the Spanish Armada in 1588, showing Portsmouth's important role in major parts of European history. In 1689, the government authorised the building of 2 new wet docks and 1 new dry dock, showing the continual investment and development turning Portsmouth into a major naval centre. However, our specific focus today is the West Africa Squadron, a unit founded after the abolition of slavery in 1807. This marked an exciting and new development in Britain's proud military history.
Since the 1750s, there had been murmurings of discontent amongst religious groups, such as the Quakers, and leading political figures, such as William Wilberforce, regarding the abolition of the slave trade. At this point, these groups had been largely a minority, and many expected Britain to be fully integrated into the slave trade well into the foreseeable future.
Britain had been fully integrated into the transatlantic slave trade by the 16th century. From port cities such as Liverpool and Bristol, large cargo ships bound eventually for the New World set sail via West Africa in order to acquire slaves. These slaves were acquired in return for cotton and guns. Africa did not have the industry or the resources to produce these goods. However, it had an abundance of cheap labour which Britain lacked. Therefore, it was an ideal relationship for both British merchants and African colonial leaders. Upon arrival, plantation owners would purchase slaves from the shipmasters to work on their plantations, and in return, the shipmasters would purchase goods from the plantation owners, such as sugar and tobacco, using the money they got from selling the slaves, and then they would take these goods on to Britain and sell them on for a profit.
The consistent rationale supporting British-sponsored slavery from first to last was its contribution to the wealth and power of the empire. The number of slaves shipped from Africa to America reached its peak in the 1780s, numbering 80,000 slaves per annum. Furthermore, the price of slaves and their primary output, sugar, continued to fall. An analysis of contemporary newspapers from the 18th and 19th centuries within Britain reveals the argument that slave labour was far more productive than its adversary, free labour, providing a fundamental economic argument towards its enforcement.
For instance, an extract from the Morning Post in 1806 stated, "Free labour is clearly superior on grounds of humanity, but that ground is thrown aside as unfit for the consideration of economically stringent British ministers. It was an extremely economically viable institution."
Yet as the 19th century continued, the issue of slavery became far more than purely economics. Religious groups such as Quakers began to disseminate moralistic literature towards the British public, emphasising the incompatibility of slavery with Christian values. If God created everyone equal, then why did Britain embrace an institution which directly contradicted this? The British public began to take note. The Quakers first petitioned to Parliament in 1783, where 273 of their members signed the petition for abolition. This provided a precursor for later campaigns, such as in 1788, where over 100 petitions were presented to Parliament within the space of 3 months. Politicians such as William Wilberforce were forced to take note. How could Britain call itself among the most enlightened in the world when it embraced such a barbaric institution? The British public also gradually took note of the flogging, the life of work, the separation of mother and child. The social peculiarity of the institution provided the foundations for its abolition. The 1807 Slave Trade Act abolished the trade within the British colonies.
The squadron was initially established to tackle slavery along the 1,500-mile stretch of coastline along the west of Africa. Their task, effectively policing the entire transatlantic slave trade, was never realistic with the 2 ships that were initially assigned to the squadron. Britain was still at war with France at this time, and it consumed the almost unwavering focus of both the government and the Royal Navy. And it would not be until the 1830s that the squadron would receive the investment required to make a substantial difference to the slave trade.
It should be recognised, however, that it was the British Foreign Office which kept the squadron going, despite the objections of the senior naval officials. Perhaps this can be reflected in the fact that the government paid a bounty for the capture of slaves. An adult male would pay a bounty of £60, whilst a woman would fetch 30 and a child 10. These sums, whilst they were reduced to a flat rate of £10, which fell later to 5, were hugely attractive to the naval commanders and ratings alike, and this can perhaps go some way to explaining the Navy's willingness to continue with the squadron.
The hatches were opened, and such a scene never was witnessed. The slaves had been battened down all day during our 9 hours' chase.
They were all seasick and the stench and filth incredible. Perhaps you can imagine 235 human beings shut in a place 50 feet by 20 feet and only 3 feet 6 inches high, just room enough to clear the top of their heads when they are in the sitting position.
They cried and sang, and those who could danced with delight.
It's hard for us to imagine today just what conditions would have been like aboard the ships serving in the squadron. 55 in every 1,000 would perish in the line of duty. Compare this to only 10 in every 1,000 on board ships serving in the Mediterranean. It was without question the most dangerous place to serve in the entire Royal Navy during the 1800s. Between the years of 1834 to 1860, 1,587 crewmen would die. The reasons for their death varied. Some were killed in accidents, other when stopping the slavers. But there was such a fear of yellow fever that one of the ship's surgeons had to as a result, turn to drinking sick to prove to the men that it wasn't contagious. He then proceeded to eat a normal meal.
It was not until 1835 that the equipment clause allowed for the seizure of slave ships simply for possessing items such as chains and manacles that were necessary for the transportation of slaves. This, combined with the introduction of steam-powered warships from 1840, allowed for a far more successful combating of the slave trade than had initially been achieved. Nonetheless, it's important to remember that the West Africa Squadron succeeded in capturing over 1,600 slave ships and liberated over 150,000 slaves. Meanwhile, they acted as a constant deterrent to the slave traders of the West African coast, meaning that far less slaves were transported than possibly would have been otherwise. Even if slaves were fortunate enough to be rescued by the men of the West Africa Squadron, their safety was not always guaranteed. The diseases and malnutrition that had decimated slave populations on board ship continued to exert their toll as they were escorted by the British to the island of St Helena. Here, they were processed before repatriation or transportation to British Sierra Leone. In 2009, archaeologists uncovered the remains of over 10,000 African men, women and children on the island. Diseases such as smallpox and dysentery, which had been rife on board ship, continued to spread once the slaves had reached land. Sadly, many of those that survived the torments of transportation succumbed to illness before they could be sent home.
Freetown was part of the larger colony of the Sierra Leone, which was founded by the Sierra Leone Company in 1787. The SLC, organised by British abolitionist William Wilberforce, sought to rehabilitate the black poor of London, and former slaves of North America by bringing them to the settlement in Sierra Leone where it was believed that they would stop the African slave trade by spreading Christianity through the continent. From 1808 to 1874, Freetown was the headquarters for the West African Squadron, which captured slave ships headed for the Americas and released their cargo into the city.
The fate of the free slaves was not always ideal. After a long journey to Sierra Leone, many would die on board the ships. On arrival, they would have a choice. They could go back to the West Indies, working as apprentices, join the British military, or stay in Sierra Leone and work as labourers. Nearly all of the free slaves would stay in Sierra Leone. There were multiple tribes, over 200 languages, and often a lot of fighting. They weren't home, but they were free. They made the best of a bad situation. Staying in Sierra Leone would protect them from recapture and a life of enslavement.
The unwary, unostentatious, and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the history of nations.